Good afternoon. It's a privilege to share this conference panel with my esteemed co-panelist, Tessa Chenoweth. I would like to thank the Center for the Studies of Home for arranging the Homework Connections Conference, and also thank you to the Jeffrey Museum of the Home for hosting it. I am deeply grateful to Allison Blunt and to Jacqueline Winston-Smith for making this recording available. I look forward to a near-term future in which travel funds are readily available to all researchers of the home and of homework connections. I'm presently working on this mandate under the auspices of a United Nations funding source, so there is some irony to this being a virtually delivered paper. Locating love and bastardy in the interstice between domestic service and domestic space in early modern London households. Early modern writers often conflated the labor of paid domestics in the household with the unpaid work that was the province of women within the home. Consider, for instance, contemporary use of the word employment, as in this usage. Our English housewife is the mother and mistress of the family, and hath her most general employments within the house. Further tangling the idea of a housewife's employments, servant maids who were formerly hired as waged workers were said to be performing whatever act of housewifery is necessary in the family. For early modern people, the word household evoked contractual relationships. The head of the household was responsible for all of the people living under their roof, including servants. In the pre-industrial metropolis, the household was also very often one's workplace. Home, in contrast, was a term describing the ineffability but also the power of affective relationships. A person's home was the literal seat of their community ties. So let's consider, for purposes of discussion, that for people in early modern London, the experience of living in domestic space was affective, that is, emotionally anchored, while domestic service was contractual, it was paid work. This is the interstice I reference in the paper title. And, as we researchers know, we can often find interesting things in the cracks between definitions. How might a laboring woman, a servant who lived in London 320 years ago, use this interstice between domestic service and domestic space to advantage? I have evidence that in the period between 1694 and 1706, at least one such woman relied on the materiality of the houses in which she lived and worked as a way of shaping community perceptions of her identity. She deliberately utilized the liminal, ambiguous meanings of household and home as a device to establish a public identity for herself that cast her in a far better light than her prior circumstances should have allowed for, creating a picture of her own genteel status as a mother that disguised her position as a domestic servant of indeterminate marital circumstances on the edge of destitution. I'm working on a new book, a microhistory that pivots on the story of Phoebe Harrison, who in 1706 countered an exceptional suit in the highest London ecclesiastical court, the Court of Arches. Ecclesiastical courts handled any case having to do with marriage. In a period before divorce was widely available, this was important. Depositions generated by this appeal suit, which originated in the Diocese of London Consistory Court, were taken from community members who both substantiated and challenged Phoebe Harrison's account, and this is the basis of the evidence I just referenced. Formally, the suit was for jactitation of marriage, that is, falsely alleging marriage. Louis Anthony de Moraes sought to secure a judgment determining that he was not married to Phoebe Harrison. Harrison wanted the reverse. As we will see, witnesses to the suit pointed to the literal fabric of the houses in which Phoebe Harrison lived for the descriptive details that made their depositions persuasive. Here again is the interstice between household and home, and indeed between bastardy and love. In each pairing, one element is contractual and the other is affective. The outlines of Harrison's story will become clear in the excerpts following. These are taken from the depositions of two different families who provided places for Phoebe Harrison to live in the mid-1690s. The first pair of depositions, from Jane and John Page, depict Harrison's time in Epsom, then Evesham, just outside of London proper, where Harrison met Maurice originally. The second pair of depositions depict the way that the stars aligned for Harrison and Maurice a year later, a few weeks after Harrison turned up in Exchange Alley in London, pregnant, in late-stage labor, looking for a place to birth her baby. Jane Page and her daughters worked at plain work to her acquaintances and to the Exchange. We recall that in this period, the London Exchange was a prototypical outdoor shopping mall. This family activity generated enough income for the Pages to rent a house in Evesham, 22 kilometres southwest of London, in which they themselves lived and in which they sublet rooms as accommodations to lodgers. John Page's primary employment was to attend at funerals for the company of upholders. Upholders carried out not just the manufacture of upholstered goods, but were cabinet makers, undertakers, soft furnishers, auctioneers, and valuers. So we can assume that John Page was very much attuned to the fabric of houses and their meanings. Jane Page and John Page depose that they hath known Louis Anthony de Maurice about 30 years, and that Mr. Maurice lodged in John Page's house at Evesham by the space of about 6 or 7 years. They characterized Mr. Maurice as someone they knew well, a foreigner and a merchant of good credit and reputation. They confirmed Maurice's status by describing his living circumstances. Mr. Maurice is reported a rich man, and spent at least £300 per annum for all the time of his lodging, he always wearing the best of apparel, and drinking and eating the best of everything. Mr. Maurice is a Portuguese, John Page hath heard. The Pages both depose that about last Michaelmas was 12 years since Phoebe Harrison came to live as a servant in John Page's dwelling house at Evesham. She continued to live as a servant and did servile work and labor in Page's family until the beginning of January following, and for such service she received the rate of 12 pence per week, being the common wages then given to servant maids. Although Harrison lived in the Page household and was reckoned to be their responsibility for the length of her term of service, the Pages were very anxious to point out that she was a paid worker and that her prescribed activities did not include socializing with other household members. This was a description consonant with the early modern understanding of relationships appropriate within the household. John Page insisted that Phoebe Harrison did live at his house, but not in any other capacity than as a servant, and he and his wife did not introduce Mr. Maurice into Harrison's company, nor was John Page or his wife privy to any such courtship between them. However, we also learn in the Pages' depositions that Phoebe Harrison was turned out from Page's service for spending considerable time in the chamber of one of the lodgers in their house, longer than Page's wife thought was fitting or decent. The end of Harrison's tenure at the Page household is starkly rendered. Phoebe Harrison, at the time she went from John Page's house, declared that she had taken a place in the wagon from Evesham to London, and she was then in a poor, mean condition, and had but very ordinary apparel, and borrowed an old gown of John Page's wife to keep her warm, and John Page believes Mr. Maurice was then at John Page's house. We now encounter Phoebe Harrison almost 1 year later in 1695. In the intervening period, she had made her way from Epsom to the East End parish of Shoreditch. Compare the Pages' accounts of Harrison's position in the household to these of the Lowther's, who painted a very different picture of Harrison's home life and living circumstances. Robert Lowther deposed that 9 years since, Louis Anthony de Maurice told Robert Lowther he had a woman to lodge, and asked him if he had or knew of a conveniency to lodge her. The Lowthers having a house in Shoreditch, they agreed that they would lodge and board such country gentlewoman and her child. Rebecca Lowther's husband, Robert Lowther, described himself as a coffee man and draper, he being a servant at Jonathan's Coffee House in Pall Mall, London, and being and lying much oftener there than at Shoreditch. Rebecca Lowther deposed that soon after, Phoebe Harrison, who called herself Morris, came to Lowther's house with a child of about 5 weeks old, and Phoebe Harrison nursed her child there upwards of a year. Louis Anthony de Maurice deals in jewels, as Rebecca Lowther hath heard, but what he gets or thereby is worth in his estate she knows not. That she looks on him to be a person of honour and reputation, conversant with the first quality in England, and as such he is generally looked upon. Maurice was said to have provided very handsomely for Phoebe and her son during the time of her lodging. Elsewhere in the Arches suit, it becomes clear that Maurice was providing financial support to Harrison and their son of approximately £30 per annum, which would have been equivalent to the annual wages of an established skilled tradesman. Interestingly, however, it was not the amount of money that Maurice supplied which stood as contractual evidence of the marriage in the minds of the witnesses to the suit. Rather, it was the obviously affective nature of the relationship between Harrison and Maurice, played out as a tableau within the setting of the home. This is one of the more intimate descriptions offered in the suit. Louis and Phoebe were several times together alone in the Lowthers' bedroom, this room being the Lowthers' dining room, leaving a bed at one end of it and only a curtain drawn between the bed and that part of the room used as a dining room. Robert Lowther hath seen Maurice and Harrison eat a crust of bread and drink a glass of wine together there in his dwelling house. Again, it is the depiction of the fabric of the house, the details of home, that are most important to the witness's depositions. We can now see the utility of bed curtains and bed covers from a new frame of reference. They were often the only partitions separating public from private, the contractual from the affective, and it was easy for landlords to keep tabs on renters, even if those renters were people of means. The affective relationship between Phoebe Harrison and Louis Maurice was clearly genuine and quite passionate. Pursuant to whether they were actually married, I leave you with Rebecca Lowther's assessment. She has several times been in the company of Louis Maurice and Phoebe Harrison, and sometimes seen them very loving together, and at other times seen them very angry at each other. But Louis always provided for Phoebe. That she hath heard Phoebe in passion tell Louis she was his wife, and Louis said the devil married her then, and she said it was the devil in his clothes. And they then struck each other and were in a great rage, and so parted. But Rebecca Lowther and others were then present, and then Louis Maurice hath desired Rebecca Lowther to make them friends again. A decade later, as another witness in the suit deposed, Harrison had become more determined. At that point, Harrison said that she and Mr. Maurice were at a difference, and that Mr. Maurice denied her to be his wife, and said that she would try whether he was her husband or no, or to that effect, and said that if she would not prove it, she might prove him an old rogue or herself a young whore, or something to that effect. For Harrison, a successful outcome to the suit turned on the problem of establishing or fabricating a public identity and relying on the ideas of household and home in order to do it. In the liminal period before centralized record-keeping, the business of proving one's identity and marital status could be sketchy. Harrison's assertion that she had wed Maurice in a fleet marriage was her ultimate, unprovable trump card. A fleet marriage was a euphemism for a clandestine marriage that took place in London's Fleet Prison or its environs, the so-called liberties of the Fleet, during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Clergymen operating in and around the prison could not effectively be prosecuted for their ministry, and so a booming clandestine marriage business among unlicensed clergy was carried on there. A fleet marriage was respectable, but hard to prove. As a result, the circumstantial evidence that Harrison was able to surround herself with, within the dwelling she called home, mattered considerably. Conference delegates just have to look around them, here in the Jeffrey, to imagine vividly how it might have felt to be Phoebe Harrison in any of the lodgings she describes, especially with respect to the level of privacy she could call her own. Other depositions in the suit reveal that Harrison lived in an almshouse in Evesham just before she went to work and live in the Page household. The almshouse that has become the Jeffrey Museum was built only 2 decades after that. In early modern London, people of wildly varying social and economic circumstances lived cheek by jowl in dwellings that might only be separated by a party wall or less. However, in early modern London, people of all classes were also highly itinerant, moving between neighborhoods or in and out of the metropolis. It was a good place to take advantage of anonymity. Harrison evidently realized that she had to install in community minds the idea that she was home in order to avoid being reported to the parish overseers for having birthed a bastard child. Phoebe's aim was to obtain an ongoing stipend with which to support her son. She was clearly ardent in pursuing it. Notwithstanding their proximity to Phoebe Harrison's person, other people around her were unable to determine conclusively for more than a decade whether she was married or not, nor what the true nature of her relationship with Maurice was. Looking into the interstice between domestic space and domestic service, that is, considering the space between women's contractual and affective roles, we see that these could be manipulated even by people of small means as a way of acquiring personal agency. Roles appropriate to the home, but also the household, were enacted in the same dwellings. Phoebe Harrison used exactly this interstice to advantage. She relied on being able to reshape her image depending on what circumstances required of her. She knew how to labor successfully in the workplace of the household, and she thereby succeeded in hiding her relationship with her child's father from her employers. Harrison also knew how to regroup from the defeat of having been fired and then deploy the idea of home in order to turn a house into the prospect of refuge for herself and her baby. People in the past used their dwellings as sources not only of refuge but also of self-advertisement. Nominally private dwellings were very public places, as Harrison's story shows us, and people of small means took every opportunity to present their own living circumstances in a favorable light. I posit that knowing how to play on the ambiguous conceptual space between the affective and the contractual within the household or the home was not uncommon as a source of agency among laboring people in the early modern metropolis. I leave that idea with you in hope that it's a useful tool for the research toolbox. Thank you.